Rachel Chen woke up every morning at 5:30, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Being a middle school teacher meant early mornings, late nights grading papers, and a salary that somehow never quite stretched to the end of the month. But she loved it. She loved seeing that moment when a struggling student finally understood a difficult concept. She loved the way kids' faces lit up when they talked about their dreams. Her apartment was small, just a studio on the third floor of an old building where the heating worked when it felt like it. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, and the faucet dripped no matter how many times she tried to fix it. But it was hers, and she made it cozy with secondhand furniture and plants she'd grown from cuttings. Every morning, Rachel had the same routine. She'd put on her teaching clothes, which she rotated carefully to make her limited wardrobe look more varied than it actually was. Then she'd grab her bag, stuffed with student papers and lesson plans, and head out the door. Her one small luxury, the thing she refused to give up no matter how tight money got, was her morning coffee from Pete's Corner Cafe. Pete's wasn't fancy. It was just a small neighborhood spot with worn wooden tables and mismatched chairs. The paint on the walls had faded years ago, and the menu board was the kind you had to squint to read. But Pete, the owner, made decent coffee, and it was on her way to school. Most importantly, it was cheap. Rachel always ordered the same thing, a small black coffee, nothing added. It cost $2.50, which was about all she could justify spending. The cafe had its regulars. There was Mrs. Lopez, who came in every morning for a tea and a bagel. There was the construction crew that showed up around 6, loud and joking with each other. There was the young couple who always sat by the window, holding hands across the table. Rachel had been coming here for 3 years, and she recognized most of the faces, even if she didn't know their names. But one Tuesday in late September, Rachel noticed someone new. He was sitting in the back corner, in the spot where hardly anyone ever sat, because the chair was wobbly and the table was scarred with coffee rings. An older man, maybe in his 70s, wearing a gray coat that had seen better days. He sat very still, staring out the window at nothing in particular. In front of him was a small glass of water, the kind Pete gave out for free to anyone who asked. Rachel didn't think much of it that first morning. People came and went all the time. But the next day he was there again. Same table, same gray coat, same glass of water, and the day after that, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, Rachel found herself looking for him when she walked in. He was always there, always alone. He never talked to anyone, never pulled out a phone or a book. Just sat there, quiet as a shadow, looking out that window like he was watching a movie only he could see. There was something about his face that stuck with Rachel. It was deeply lined, the kind of face that had lived a long life. But his eyes were what got to her. They looked sad and far away, like he was somewhere else entirely, somewhere painful he couldn't escape from. Other customers would glance at him and look away quickly. Some would whisper to their friends. Rachel noticed that people avoided sitting near him, even when the cafe was crowded. It was like he was invisible, or worse, like people could see him but chose to pretend they couldn't. Rachel understood that feeling more than she cared to admit. When you're struggling financially, people look at you differently. They make assumptions. She'd felt those looks when she paid for groceries with carefully counted bills, or when she had to tell friends she couldn't go out because she didn't have the money. Being invisible, being overlooked, it hurt in a way that was hard to explain. The old man never ordered anything, not once. Pete would walk by his table sometimes, giving him a look that wasn't quite friendly but wasn't mean either. It was more like resignation, like Pete had decided this was just how things were going to be. 3 weeks passed. October arrived with its cold mornings and earlier sunsets. Rachel noticed the old man's coat looked thinner than it should for the dropping temperatures. He'd wrap it tighter around himself, but she could see him shiver slightly when the door opened and let in a gust of wind. She started to wonder about him. Did he have a family? Where did he live? Why did he come here every single morning? The questions circled in her mind, but she never asked. She was raised to be polite, not to intrude, to mind her own business. But one morning something changed. Rachel was running late, stressed about a parent-teacher conference she had that afternoon. She rushed into the cafe, ordered her usual coffee, and was about to leave when she heard Pete talking to another customer at the counter. That old guy's been sitting there for over a month now, Pete said, keeping his voice low but not quite low enough. Never buys a thing. Just takes up space. I've got paying customers who need those seats. The other customer, a man in a business suit, glanced back at the old man and shrugged. Can't you ask him to leave if he's not buying anything? Pete sighed. I probably should. I'm running a business, not a shelter. Rachel felt something twist in her chest. She looked at the old man in his corner. He seemed smaller somehow, more fragile than he had a few weeks ago. His hands were folded on the table and he was staring at that same spot outside the window. She thought about her own struggles. She thought about the times she'd felt judged, dismissed, treated as less than. She thought about her father, who had passed away 5 years ago, and how he used to say that the measure of a person wasn't in what they had, but in what they did when they had very little. Rachel stood there for a long moment, her coffee getting cold in her hand, making a decision that would change everything. Rachel's car broke down on a Wednesday in early November. She was driving home from school when she heard a grinding sound, followed by a horrible clunking noise that made her heart sink. She managed to pull over before the car completely gave up. But when the mechanic looked at it the next day, the news was worse than she'd feared. Your transmission's going, he said, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. I can patch it for now, but you're looking at about $800 for a proper fix. Maybe more. $800. Rachel felt her stomach drop. She had maybe $200 in her checking account and payday was still a week and a half away. She'd been so careful, budgeting every dollar, but there was just never enough cushion for emergencies like this. How much for the patch job? She asked, already knowing she'd regret it. $250. But it won't last long. Maybe a few months if you're lucky. She paid it, watching her bank balance drop to almost nothing. That night she sat at her tiny kitchen table and went through her finances again, looking for something, anything she could cut. She'd already stopped buying lunch and was bringing leftovers from home. She'd already canceled her streaming subscriptions. Her phone was the cheapest plan available. Rent was due in 2 weeks. She looked at her budget and circled the one thing she could eliminate: her morning coffee. $2.50 5 days a week. It wasn't much, but over a month it added up to $50. $50 she desperately needed. The next morning, Rachel walked past Pete's cafe without stopping. It felt wrong, like skipping a part of herself, but she kept walking. At school, she had a pounding headache by 10 o'clock, her body protesting the lack of caffeine it had grown used to. She drank water from the fountain and pushed through, but the morning after that Friday, something made her stop outside Pete's window. Through the glass, she could see the old man in his usual corner. She hadn't realized how much she'd been looking forward to seeing him there, to that small connection between two people who didn't even know each other's names. He looked worse than before. His face was gaunter, his cheekbones more prominent. The gray coat hung looser on his frame. When had he gotten so thin? Had it been gradual, or had she just not been paying attention? Rachel stood there on the sidewalk, cold wind cutting through her jacket, watching him through the window. He lifted his glass of water with a slight tremor in his hand. Something about that small gesture broke her heart. She thought about Pete's words from weeks ago, taking up space from paying customers. She thought about how people looked away from him, how they avoided his table even when the cafe was full. She thought about invisibility, about what it felt like to be someone the world had decided didn't matter. Before she could talk herself out of it, Rachel pushed open the door. The warmth of the cafe hit her immediately, along with the smell of coffee and toasted bread. Pete looked up from behind the counter, surprised to see her. Hey, stranger. Thought you'd abandoned us. Just had a rough week, Rachel said, walking to the counter. Her heart was pounding. She opened her wallet and looked at the bills inside. $23. That was supposed to last her until Wednesday, until payday. 4 more days of gas, of maybe buying something cheap for dinner if she got too hungry. She looked at the old man again. He was staring out the window, unaware that anyone was looking at him. Pete, Rachel heard herself say, can you make a coffee and one of those blueberry muffins? She paused, then nodded toward the corner table. And take it to him, please. Pete's eyebrows shot up. The old guy? Yeah. Rachel, you don't have to, I know, just please. Pete studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. All right. What do you want for yourself? Nothing today. Just that. Come on, you always get coffee. No, not today. Pete made the coffee and plated the muffin. Rachel paid, watching $8.50 disappear from her wallet. $14.50 left, 4 days until payday. She watched as Pete carried the items to the back corner. The old man looked up, confused, his weathered face creasing with questions. Pete said something and pointed toward Rachel. The old man turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers across the cafe. Rachel gave a small wave, trying to smile even though her chest felt tight. She wasn't expecting anything in return. She just wanted him to know that someone saw him, that someone cared. The old man's eyes filled with tears. He pressed his palms together in front of his chest in a gesture of deep gratitude, bowing his head slightly. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound, but Rachel felt the weight of his thanks like a physical thing. She nodded back at him, then turned and left the cafe, her own eyes stinging. She walked to her car, climbed in and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Her stomach was already growling. She'd skipped breakfast to save money and now she'd just spent money she couldn't afford on a stranger. But somehow it felt right. It felt necessary. The weekend was hard. Rachel ate rice and canned vegetables, stretching her groceries as far as they would go. She graded papers at home instead of going anywhere that might tempt her to spend money. On Sunday night, she counted her money again. $10.75. 3 days until payday. Monday morning, Rachel decided to walk past Pete's again. She couldn't afford to stop. Couldn't afford to be tempted to spend money she didn't have. But as she approached, she saw Pete standing outside smoking a cigarette. When he spotted her, he waved her over. "Hey, come here a second." Rachel crossed the street, confused. "What's up?" Pete took a drag of his cigarette and blew out smoke. "That old man you bought coffee for on Friday? He came up to me after you left, handed me a $10 bill and pointed at you, then at the door you'd walked out of. Didn't say a word, just pointed. I think he wants to buy you coffee." Rachel felt her throat tighten. "He doesn't have to do that, I know." But he was pretty insistent. Wouldn't take the money back. Pete pulled out his wallet and showed her a $10 bill with a note attached. "For the teacher." "I don't know how he knew what I do," Rachel said quietly. "Small neighborhood. People talk. People notice more than you think." Pete stubbed out his cigarette. "Come on, your coffee's getting cold." That morning, Rachel sat in Pete's cafe with a free coffee in front of her, watching the old man in his corner. He gave her that same gentle nod and she nodded back. It felt like an agreement, like a promise between two people who understood what it meant to have almost nothing but still want to give. Over the next week, a pattern emerged. On Tuesday, Rachel used a few dollars from her paycheck to buy the old man a coffee and a bagel. On Wednesday, Pete handed her a coffee, paid for. On Thursday, Rachel bought him breakfast again. On Friday, her coffee was waiting, paid for. They never spoke. He never made a sound. But every exchange felt like a conversation, like two souls recognizing each other across the space between tables. Rachel started to wonder about him more intensely. Who was he? Why didn't he speak? Where was his family? The questions burned in her mind, but she never asked.
The silent exchange felt sacred somehow.
Fragile, like speaking might break whatever was building between them. Then came the Friday morning that changed everything. Rachel pushed open the door to Pete's cafe that Friday morning with a feeling of anticipation she'd grown to recognize. For 3 weeks now, she and the old man had maintained their silent exchange. Some days she would buy him breakfast, scraping together a few dollars from her carefully managed budget. Other days, mysteriously, her coffee would be waiting for her, already paid for. It had become the best part of her mornings, this wordless conversation with a stranger who somehow felt like a friend. But when she stepped inside and looked toward the back corner, the table was empty. Rachel felt her heart sink. The wobbly chair sat vacant. The scarred table had nothing on it except the usual coffee rings that never seemed to come clean. She stood there, frozen in the doorway as other customers brushed past her with their morning rush energy. Pete looked up from behind the counter and caught her expression. He gave her a sympathetic shrug, like he knew what she was looking for and didn't have good news. "Where is he?" Rachel asked, walking up to the counter. "The man who usually sits in the corner?" "Haven't seen him this morning," Pete said, wiping down the espresso machine. "First time in weeks he hasn't shown up." Rachel felt worry knot in her stomach. Was he okay? Had something happened to him? She realized with a start that she knew nothing about him. Not where he lived, not his name, not if he had anyone looking after him. Their entire connection had been built on coffee and silence and the understanding that comes from two people who know what it's like to struggle, If he comes in, will you tell him I was asking about him? Rachel said. Sure thing. Want your usual? Rachel ordered her coffee, paid for it herself, and sat down at her usual table. But the cafe felt different without him there. Emptier. She sipped her coffee slowly, watching the door, hoping he might walk through it. He didn't. At school that day, Rachel couldn't concentrate. During her lunch break, she found herself thinking about the old man, making up stories to explain his absence. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he'd found somewhere warmer to spend his mornings. Maybe he'd decided to stop coming because he couldn't keep trading coffee purchases with her anymore. That last thought bothered her the most. Had her gesture of kindness turned into something that stressed him? Had he felt obligated to keep buying her coffee when he clearly had so little himself? The next morning, Saturday, Rachel found herself walking to Pete's even though she usually stayed home on weekends. The cafe was more crowded, filled with people who had time to linger over their breakfast, reading newspapers and talking in groups. The corner table was still empty. Sunday morning, the same thing. No old man, just an empty chair and a table that seemed lonelier than any table should. By Monday, Rachel had resigned herself to the idea that she might never see him again. People came and went from Pete's all the time. That was life in the city. You made brief connections with strangers and then they disappeared, and you never knew what happened to them. It was one of the loneliest parts of living around so many people. She walked into Pete's that Monday morning with lower expectations. She'd order her coffee, go to work, and try to stop thinking about the old man, who had somehow become important to her, without either of them ever exchanging a word. But when she walked through the door, Pete immediately caught her eye and pointed to her usual table. Sitting there, right in the middle of the table where she always sat, was her coffee. It was still steaming, freshly made, and underneath the cup was what looked like a folded piece of paper, a napkin maybe with something written on it. Rachel walked over slowly. Her hands were shaking slightly as she lifted the coffee cup and picked up the napkin. The handwriting was shaky, the letters uneven, like whoever wrote it had struggled to hold the pen steady. Table 7, please. Rachel looked up. Table 7 was in the back, in a different corner from where the old man usually sat. It was actually a nicer table, by the window where the morning light came in, and sitting there, her back to Rachel, was a woman. She had dark hair pulled back in a neat style, and she was wearing what looked like expensive business clothes, a tailored jacket in deep blue. The woman must have sensed Rachel staring because she turned around. Their eyes met and the woman gave a small, sad smile. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Rachel's mind was racing. Who was this woman? What did she want? Where was the old man? The note had been in his handwriting, she was sure of it. That shaky script looked like it belonged to someone with aged hands. She walked to table 7 carrying her coffee. Up close, she could see the woman was probably in her mid-40s with kind eyes that looked tired, like she hadn't slept well in a long time. Rachel Chen? The woman asked softly. Rachel nodded, surprised to hear her full name. She sat down slowly, placing her coffee on the table. How do you know my name? I asked around. Pete told me. The woman extended her hand. My name is Catherine Hartwell. I need to talk to you about my father. The pieces started clicking into place. Your father. The man who sits. Who was sitting in the corner? Yes. Catherine's eyes were already glistening with tears, though she was clearly trying to hold them back. His name is Richard. Richard Hartwell. And you've been buying him coffee? Sometimes, Rachel said carefully. He's bought me coffee too. We help each other out, I guess. Catherine nodded, a tear finally escaping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, professionally, like someone used to keeping her emotions in check. Can I tell you about my father? Please. 2 years ago, my mother died. They'd been married for 47 years. She was his everything. Catherine's voice was steady, but Rachel could hear the pain underneath it. After she passed, my father just shut down. He stopped talking. Not because he couldn't speak, but because he chose not to. Depression, the doctor said. Severe depression and grief. We tried everything. Therapy, medication, support groups, different doctors. Nothing helped. Rachel listened, her coffee forgotten, her heart already aching for this man she'd been silently sharing mornings with. He used to be an architect, Catherine continued. A successful one. He designed buildings all over the state. But after Mom died, he couldn't work anymore. Couldn't concentrate. He'd just sit at home staring at nothing. We were so worried about him. My brother and I, we took turns checking on him, but we both have jobs, families. We couldn't be there every moment. How did he end up at Pete's? Rachel asked. He started going out for walks, just wandering the neighborhood. One day, about 2 months ago, he found this cafe. Started coming here every morning. I think he liked it because it reminded him of a place he and Mom used to go to when they were young. He'd sit in that corner for hours, and when we'd ask him about it, he wouldn't answer. But he kept going back, so we figured at least he was getting out of the house. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out a tissue, dabbing at her eyes. I was so worried he was bothering people, that he was just sitting there taking up space without buying anything. I offered to give him money to buy coffee, but he refused. I think he felt like he didn't deserve anything. Like the world owed him nothing and he owed the world nothing back. Rachel felt tears forming in her own eyes now. She understood that feeling. She'd felt it herself on her worst days when the bills piled up and her car broke down and everything felt hopeless. Then something changed, Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly. About 3 weeks ago he came home different. Not talking yet, but different. He had this look in his eyes like he'd woken up from a long sleep. And the next day he went out and came home with groceries. He made himself a proper meal. The day after that he showered without us having to remind him. He started taking care of himself again. I don't understand, Rachel said softly. Catherine looked directly at her, and now the tears were flowing freely. A few days ago he finally spoke. First words in 2 years. He said your name. He said Rachel bought me coffee. Then he told us everything. How you'd been coming to this cafe every morning. How he'd watched you, noticed you were struggling too. How one day you bought him breakfast even though he could see you couldn't really afford it. How you saw him when everyone else looked away. Rachel's hand went to her mouth. I just wanted him to know someone cared. You did more than that. You gave him a reason to care about himself again. Rachel sat frozen at table 7, trying to process what Catherine had just told her. The old man, Richard, had started speaking again after 2 years of silence. And somehow, impossibly, she had something to do with it. I still don't understand, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. All I did was buy him coffee a few times. That's nothing. That shouldn't have made such a difference. Catherine shook her head, a sad smile crossing her face. You think it was nothing, but to my father it was everything. Let me explain something about depression, about the kind of grief my father was going through. When my mother died, he didn't just lose his wife. He lost his purpose. He lost his sense of being part of the world. Every day he felt invisible. He felt like he didn't matter anymore, like his existence was just taking up space that could be better used by someone else. Rachel nodded slowly. She'd felt shades of that feeling herself. On the hardest days when her bank account was empty and her car was breaking down and it seemed like she was working herself to exhaustion for nothing. He went to that cafe every morning. Because it was somewhere to be, Catherine continued. Somewhere that wasn't his empty house with all of Mom's things still in it. But even there, he felt invisible. People would look through him like he was furniture. Pete would give him water and tolerate his presence, but my father knew he was seen as a burden. Someone taking up a table without buying anything. Catherine paused, gathering herself. Then you came along. And you didn't just see him. You recognized something in him. When you bought him that first coffee and muffin, he told me he cried. He sat in that corner and cried into his hands because someone had acknowledged him as a human being who deserved kindness. Rachel felt tears streaming down her own face now. But he bought me coffee too. He didn't have to do that. That's exactly the point, Catherine said, leaning forward. You gave him something to do for someone else. For 2 years he'd felt useless. Then suddenly he had a purpose again. He could help you. He noticed you were struggling too. He could see it in the way you counted your money carefully, in the way you only ever ordered the cheapest thing on the menu. You gave him a reason to care again, Rachel. Not just about himself, but about another person. Catherine reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, made of expensive cream-colored paper. She slid it across the table to Rachel. My father wanted me to give you this. He wanted to meet you himself, but his therapist thought it might be too overwhelming for him right now. He's finally agreed to go back to treatment, to really work on his grief and depression. But before he started, he made me promise to find you and give you this. Rachel stared at the envelope like it might bite her. I don't need anything. I'm just glad he's doing better. Please, Catherine said gently. Open it, this is important to him. To all of us. With shaking hands, Rachel picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed, just tucked closed. She opened it and pulled out two things. The first was a letter, written in that same shaky handwriting as the note under her coffee cup. The second was a check. Rachel looked at the check first because it was right on top. When she saw the amount, her vision went blurry. $15,000. Made out to her. Signed by Richard Hartwell. I can't accept this, Rachel said immediately, trying to push the check back across the table. This is too much. This is insane. I can't take his money. It's not charity, Catherine said firmly, not taking the check. Read the letter, please. Rachel's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the paper. She unfolded it and read, Dear Rachel, I am sorry we never spoke. I wish I had found my voice sooner so I could have thanked you properly. But maybe silence was what we both needed. Sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. You bought me coffee when you had so little for yourself. I watched you count your money carefully each time. I saw you stop coming to the cafe for a few days and I knew it was because you were struggling. When you came back and bought me breakfast anyway, I understood what you had sacrificed to do that. You didn't see a stranger. You didn't see a burden or someone taking up space. You saw another human being who needed kindness and you gave it freely, even when it cost you something real. For 2 years, I believed I didn't matter anymore. I believed the world would be the same or better without me in it. Then you showed me I was wrong. You showed me that one person can make a difference to another person, that small acts of kindness can break through walls that nothing else can penetrate. You reminded me that I still have value, that I can still help others, that I still have a purpose. This money is not charity, it's gratitude. Before I retired, I was an architect. I was fortunate in my career and in my investments. This amount means something to you right now, but it's something I can afford to give. I learned from you that giving when it costs you something is what makes it meaningful. Please accept this. Pay off your car, buy groceries without counting every dollar. Take a breath, and know that by accepting this, you're allowing an old man to feel useful again. You're letting me give back even a fraction of what you gave me. You taught me that kindness is a language we can speak even in silence. You reminded me that seeing someone, really seeing them, might be the most powerful thing we can do for another person. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for reminding me that I still belong in this world. With deepest gratitude, Richard. By the time Rachel finished reading, she was sobbing. Not quiet tears, but full, gasping sobs that she couldn't control. Other customers in the cafe were starting to look over, but she didn't care. Catherine reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. He means every word, Catherine said softly. And there's more. My father wants to start a foundation. He wants to help teachers like you who are struggling financially while doing one of the most important jobs in the world. He's been meeting with lawyers and accountants. He says you inspired him to do it. You gave him a purpose again. Rachel couldn't speak. She just held the letter and the check, trying to comprehend how her small act of buying a stranger coffee had somehow spiraled into this moment. Where is he now? Rachel finally managed to ask. He's enrolled in a residential treatment program, Catherine said. It's a place that specializes in grief and depression. He'll be there for at least 3 months. But he's doing the work. He's really trying. And it's because of you, because you showed him that he still matters. Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Can I write to him? Catherine's face lit up. He would love that. I'll give you the address. She pulled out a business card and wrote an address on the back. He told me to tell you that he hopes you'll keep going to Pete's Cafe. He says it's a good place and you deserve to have your coffee every morning without worrying about the cost. I don't know what to say, Rachel whispered. You don't have to say anything. Just accept his gift. Let him do this for you. Catherine stood up, gathering her purse. I need to get to work, but I wanted to meet you in person. I wanted to see the woman who gave my father his life back. They stood facing each other. Then Catherine pulled Rachel into a hug, holding her tightly. Thank you, Catherine whispered. You'll never fully understand what you did for our family. We thought we were losing him. Now we have hope again. After Catherine left, Rachel sat back down at table 7. She looked at the check again, at the amount that would change everything for her. No more sleepless nights worrying about bills. No more counting pennies. No more choosing between car repairs and groceries. But more than the money, she felt something else. A sense of connection, of purpose, of belonging to something bigger than herself. She'd gone into Pete's cafe all those weeks ago just wanting a cheap cup of coffee. She'd found something so much more valuable. Rachel sat at table 7 for a long time after Catherine left, just staring at the check and the letter. The cafe moved around her with its usual morning rhythm. Pete called out orders. The espresso machine hissed and gurgled. Customers chatted and laughed and complained about traffic. Normal life continuing on, while Rachel felt like her entire world had shifted. She looked up and caught Pete watching her from behind the counter. He walked over, wiping his hands on his apron. "You okay?" he asked. "I don't know," Rachel said honestly. "I think so, maybe, I'm not sure yet." Pete nodded like that made perfect sense. "That was the old man's daughter?" "Yes, his name is Richard. Richard Hartwell." "Huh. 2 months he came here and I never knew his name." Pete looked toward the empty corner table. "Shows you how little we really see people, doesn't it?" Rachel couldn't have said it better herself. That afternoon, after a day at school where she could barely focus on teaching, Rachel went to the bank. She deposited the check, half expecting the teller to tell her it was fake, that this couldn't be real. But the teller processed it normally, like $15,000 checks came through every day. Maybe for some people they did. "This will be on hold for a few business days," the teller said. "But it should clear by Thursday." Rachel walked out of the bank in a daze. On the way home, she stopped at a stationery store and bought nice writing paper and a good pen. That night, sitting at her small kitchen table, she wrote her first letter to Richard. She told him about her students, about the boy who'd been failing English all semester, but had just turned in a perfect essay about his grandfather, about the girl who was so shy she never spoke in class but had started writing beautiful poetry. She told him about why she became a teacher, about how she believed education could change lives. And she told him about her own struggles, about her car breaking down, about counting pennies and skipping meals, about feeling invisible sometimes, feeling like she was working so hard and getting nowhere. "But you reminded me why I do this," she wrote. "You reminded me that small acts of kindness ripple out in ways we can't predict or control. Every day I try to see my students the way you needed someone to see you. Really see them. Not just as names on a roster or test scores, but as human beings with their own struggles and dreams and fears. You taught me that being seen might be the most fundamental human need we have." She mailed the letter the next day. The check cleared on Thursday, just like the teller had said. Rachel paid off her car repairs. She paid her rent 3 months in advance. She went grocery shopping without looking at prices, filling her cart with fresh vegetables and good coffee and the kind of food she'd been denying herself for years. But she didn't quit her job. She didn't change her life dramatically. She just breathed easier. She slept better. She stopped waking up at 3 in the morning panicking about money. 2 weeks later, she received her first letter back from Richard. His handwriting was still shaky but stronger somehow. Less uncertain. "Dear Rachel," it read. "Thank you for your letter. My therapist said writing might be good for me, so I'm trying. It's hard to put feelings into words after so long being silent. I want you to know that I'm doing better. Some days are harder than others. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. But I'm learning to live with it instead of being buried by it. I'm learning that I can miss my wife and still want to be alive. Those two things can exist together. Your students are lucky to have you. Keep seeing them. Keep showing them they matter. You have no idea how much that will shape their lives. I'm working with lawyers on the foundation I mentioned. We're calling it the Helen Hartwell Foundation, named after my wife. She was a teacher too, did I mention that? Elementary school. She would have loved knowing that her legacy would be helping other teachers. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you for saving my life, Richard." The letters continued. Once every few weeks, Rachel would write to Richard and he would write back. They developed a correspondence, a friendship built on paper and ink and honesty. He told her about his wife, about their life together, about the pain of losing her. She told him about her father who had died when she was in college, about how she still missed him every day. 3 months later, Richard completed his treatment program. Catherine called Rachel to tell her. "He's coming home next week," Catherine said, her voice bright with hope. "He's not completely healed. I don't think you ever completely heal from something like this. But he's so much better. He's talking about going back to architecture, maybe teaching it. He wants to do something meaningful with the time he has left." "That's wonderful," Rachel said, and meant it. "He wants to meet you. Catherine said. Properly. Face to face. Would you be comfortable with that? Rachel thought about it. Part of her wanted to keep Richard in letters, in that safe space where they'd built their friendship. But a bigger part of her wanted to see the man whose life had somehow become tangled with hers. Yes, she said. I'd like that. They met at Pete's Cafe, of course. Where else would they meet? It was a Saturday morning in March, the first warm day after a long winter. Rachel arrived early and sat at her usual table, her heart pounding. When Richard walked through the door, she recognized him immediately. But he looked different. He was still thin, still wearing that gray coat, but he stood straighter. His eyes were clearer. He saw her and smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to his eyes. Rachel, he said, and his voice was warm and strong, the voice of someone who had found his way back to the world. Richard, she said, standing up. They hugged, two people who had saved each other without meaning to, without planning to, just by being human and kind in a world that often forgets how important those things are. They sat and talked for 3 hours. Pete brought them coffee and muffins, waving away Rachel's money. On the house, he said. Both of you. This is a special occasion. Richard told Rachel about his treatment, about the hard work of therapy, about learning to forgive himself for wanting to live when his wife couldn't. Rachel told him about her students, about the difference his gift had made, about how she'd been able to focus on teaching instead of constantly worrying about money. I'm starting the foundation next month, Richard said, the Helen Hartwell Foundation for Teachers. We'll provide grants to teachers who are struggling financially, nothing huge but enough to help, enough to let them breathe easier. She would be proud, Rachel said. I think she would, and I think she'd be glad I found my way back, even if it took so long. Richard paused, looking at his coffee cup. You know what I learned through all of this? Depression lies to you. It tells you you're alone, that you don't matter, that the world would be better without you, but it's lying. The truth is we're all connected in ways we can't see. What you do affects others. What they do affects you. We're all in this together, whether we realize it or not. Rachel nodded. I learned something too. I learned that you can be struggling yourself and still have something to give. I thought I had nothing, but I had enough to buy you a cup of coffee. And somehow that was everything. It was everything, Richard agreed. As they got up to leave, Rachel noticed that Richard's old corner table had a small brass plaque on it now. She walked over to read it. This table is reserved for anyone who needs a place to sit, a moment of warmth, and a reminder that they are seen, in honor of Richard and Helen Hartwell, and in celebration of the kindness of strangers. Rachel turned to Richard, tears in her eyes. Did you do this? Pete and I worked it out, Richard said. I'm funding a program here. Anyone who's struggling can sit at that table and order whatever they want. Pete will make it and I'll cover the cost. No questions asked. No judgment. Just food and coffee and a place to be. It was perfect. It was exactly right. Over the following months, Rachel watched the foundation grow. Richard recruited a board of directors, hired staff, and began accepting applications from teachers across the state. The first grants went out in September, each one accompanied by a letter explaining that the money came with no strings attached, just the hope that it would make their lives a little easier. Rachel stayed at Pete's Cafe, her morning ritual restored but transformed. She still came for coffee, but now she came to see Richard too. He'd started spending his mornings there again, but instead of sitting silent and alone, he sat at the new community table, talking to anyone who needed someone to talk to. She watched him help a young mother who was crying over bills. She watched him listen to a college student who was afraid of failing. She watched him give his attention, his time, his presence to people who needed it. He'd found his purpose, and it was beautiful. One morning, about a year after Catherine had first approached her at table 7, Rachel arrived at Pete's to find a new person sitting at Richard's old corner table. A woman in her 60s wearing a faded jacket, staring out the window with sad, distant eyes. Pete brought her a coffee and a muffin without asking, part of Richard's program. The woman looked up, surprised, and Pete said something Rachel couldn't hear. He pointed at Richard, who waved from across the cafe. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Rachel watched this scene, understanding it in her bones. Another person feeling invisible, suddenly being seen. Another life being changed by something as simple as coffee and kindness. She caught Richard's eye and they shared a smile. A smile that said, "Look what we started. Look what kindness can do." That afternoon, Rachel stood in front of her class, teaching grammar to 38th graders who mostly didn't want to be there. But she looked at each of them carefully. Really looked. She saw the girl in the back who was always tired because she worked evenings to help her family. She saw the boy who acted tough but was actually terrified of failing. She saw the quiet kid who never spoke but wrote brilliant things in his journal. She saw them all. And in seeing them, in acknowledging their struggles and their worth, she knew she was doing more than teaching English. She was doing what Richard had taught her. She was reminding them that they mattered, that they were seen, that someone cared. After class, one of her struggling students approached her desk. A boy named David who'd been failing most of his assignments. "Miss Chen," he said quietly, "I'm having trouble at home. My mom lost her job and we might lose our apartment. I can't focus on schoolwork when I'm worried about where we're going to live." Rachel remembered being that scared, that worried. She remembered what it felt like to have too much fear and not enough help. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Let's figure this out together. I can't fix everything, but maybe I can help with some things. And even if I can't, I want you to know I see what you're dealing with. Your situation is real and valid, and you're not alone in it." David's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for not just telling me to try harder." "Trying harder doesn't work when you're drowning," Rachel said. "Let me see if I can throw you a lifeline instead." That night, Rachel wrote another letter to Richard telling him about David, asking if the foundation had resources for students too, not just teachers. She knew he'd have ideas. He always did. The reply came a week later. "Let's start a student emergency fund. Small grants for kids in crisis situations. Can you help me design it? You know what they need better than I do." And so the work continued. The kindness multiplied. What had started with 1 cup of coffee had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. Years later, when people would ask Rachel about the foundation and how it started, she'd tell them the truth. She'd tell them about an old man in a gray coat who sat silent in a cafe corner, about a struggling teacher who bought him breakfast, about how they saved each other without meaning to. "The thing about kindness," she'd say, "is that it's never as small as it seems in the moment. You think you're just buying someone coffee, but really you're telling them they matter. You're reminding them they belong here. You're giving them a reason to keep going. And sometimes that's everything. Sometimes that changes everything." Richard would add, in his quiet way, "We go through life thinking we need big gestures to make a difference, grand actions, heroic deeds. But the truth is simpler and more powerful. We just need to see each other, really see each other. The rest follows from that." Pete's Cafe still stands on that corner. The community table is still there, always available, always welcoming. On busy mornings, you might see Richard there, or Rachel, or both of them, talking to whoever needs someone to talk to. And if you look carefully, you'll see other small acts of kindness happening all around. One person paying for another's coffee, someone sharing their newspaper, a regular checking on another regular who hasn't been in for a while. These aren't dramatic moments. They won't make the news. But they're the moments that matter. They're the threads that weave communities together. They're the proof that we belong to each other, whether we realize it or not. Rachel learned that lesson in a cafe corner one cold November morning. She learned that she had enough to give even when she felt like she had nothing. She learned that being seen and seeing others might be the most revolutionary act available to us. And Richard learned that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. That purpose can be found again. That life can surprise you with reasons to keep living, even when you're certain there are none left. 2 people, 2 struggles, 1 cup of coffee. That's all it took to change everything. That's all it ever takes.